Chronologically, I feel like I needed to be in the music business from as little as I can remember. Officially, I think I started when I was about 14 years old, and I decided to sell all of my baseball cards to buy DJ equipment. And DJ'd parties all throughout high school. Somewhere in there, I decided, because I was working for my high school's TV station, and I decided...
Where was this, by the way?
This was actually just down the road in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. And I decided that I wanted to create a music video show on my high school's TV station. And the guy who ran the station said, well, get somebody to send you, get a record company to send you music videos, I'll let you do the show. Thinking I wasn't going to get anybody to send me music videos, but I did. And unbeknownst to me, ended up creating the first music video show ever run out of a high school. Then I went to college and did everything that I could possibly get my hands on. I was the program director of the school's radio station. I managed the nightclub. I DJ'd at the nightclub. I booked bands. I marketed bands. I was a assistant manager at a record store. I wrote reviews for the local newspaper, and I even created another music video show. From there, I went down and I worked for a small independent record label in New York for a while that didn't really make it in the mid-90s. Then I went to a music video network in the 90s called The Box, which was a music video channel where you actually got to dial up a 900 number and select music videos. It was actually one of the first on-demand services, and at the time was pretty revolutionary. Then after that, I went to the West Coast to work at Yahoo and ran Yahoo's music programming department for 7 years, building them up from 2 million people at the time of the internet bubble to about 25 million people coming every single month by the time I left. And then from there, I went to CMT, where I oversee every aspect of music across the board for the channel. So it's music videos on the TV network, it's our website, it's mobile, it's radio, music for films, games, you name it.
So what was the inspiration or the desire to write a book?
Well, I wrote the book because throughout the last decade, there was just way too many people feeling pessimistic about the music business. I'm sure all of you have kind of felt that the music business is so bad, and I like the fact that it's actually turning around. A friend of mine, who unfortunately I can't even remember which friend, recently had a quote at South by Southwest where he basically said, "All around me, I see music companies who are really happy and excited and are doing great business. Everybody seems to be great except for 4 companies," meaning the major record companies. And I think that's largely true, but 5 or 6 years ago, it was just pessimism everywhere. And to me, pessimism is just you're not gonna have business. And I'm like, if I wanted to protect my job, and if I wanted to actually create jobs for people like yourselves, I had to try to give whatever I could back to figure out what we can do to positively move the music business back. And for years, you would always hear people talk about making a song for radio. There was never a shame in saying, how do you make a song? How do you record a song? How do you market a song? What do radio stations want? People wanted to know how to make a song made for radio. And as everything moved digitally, nobody paid attention to that. People were still saying, how do I make the song for radio? Nobody says, well, how do you make a song digitally? And so I kind of started with that notion of saying, how can we actually make a song that plays into the technology so that people are more likely going to embrace it? Because I truly still feel to this day that if you don't play into the technology, the song just doesn't get heard. So I started to see patterns while I was at Yahoo. We were dealing with over 1 billion song impressions a month between our radio player and our video player, and you started to see some of the things that I talk about in the book, and I started to do a lot of in-depth research on it, and found a lot of these commonalities. And rather than just keep it to myself, I felt that it was important for as many people who needed it to have it so the whole business could grow.
So one of the things the book does extraordinarily well, it lays out some of the elements necessary to be, at least in the ballpark, to be have a hit song. I kind of like the quote, and this sort of would be the subtitle of the book if I was involved. I'd say, how to rise above the noise and clutter, because that's really what this book is about. One of the chapters, which I found really fascinating, was your analogy of comparing a recorded album to a sports team. I mean, I think there was some really poignant analogies there, and I just wondered if you could amplify that for those of us who might not have gotten to that chapter.
Sure. One of the things that I started thinking about was buying an album was somewhat akin to being a season ticket holder at a sporting event. It's sometimes you just don't want to go see every single game, and sometimes you want to be passionate and you want to go to every single game. And by the way, you pay a premium for that. And the music business has only been interested for the last 10 or 12 years in basically creating season ticket holders. And not everybody has the money to be season ticket holders. Not everybody has the mindset to be season ticket holders. Most people just want to go and see a game. And I think that that's been one of the problems that the music business has had. And now, because technology has created the ability to not be forced into buying a whole album, is that you're actually creating that. And the problem is that sporting teams have created an ecosystem knowing that X number of people buy for a season, X number of people buy single tickets, X number of people buy suites. But the music business is having trouble adjusting to that kind of model of knowing what to do. And it's kind of crucial to do because as I think as I talk about in the book, it's been a while since I've actually discussed that portion in particular, is what happens when your team has a losing season? Well, everybody kind of scatters and goes away, and the value of the season ticket really declines. But if you keep things low enough and you get people buying enough enough solo tickets, you can actually keep the lights on and keep it in business. More importantly, I think though is that to some degree there's a premium to it. There's a premium, and I think you see that a lot. There's a company called Topspin whose mantra is to try to get fans to be buying $60 deluxe packages of albums. And part of the reason why is because if you're a fan, you're going to want to pay the most possible. You want to pay for access. You want to pay because of the artists. The music business is kind of idiotic because we don't charge that premium for the season ticket holders. Every time you see a Billboard #1, in order to get that #1, they deep discount the album. Is that every single time the album comes out, it's basically instead of charging $11.99, they charge $8.99. I actually kind of say that, imagine I spend a year telling you how great Avatar is, and I'm going to spend $100 million on Avatar and put all these special effects, show you little clips and to tease you about how Avatar is going to be so great. You get so excited, you say, I want it great. And I say, okay, you're all the biggest fans of Avatar. You can't wait to see the movie. I'm going to do the first midnight screening. You can be the first people on it, and for the privilege of being on the first screening, I'm going to charge you $2.50. And then everybody who's going to come next weekend has to pay the full $12.
Right.
It's insane. But that's exactly what the music business does every single week.
Every week.
Every single week. It's insane. It makes sense after a while. It's like after Avatar's out for a while, you want to pay $2.50. But, and by the way, the music business used to operate this way. The Eagles' greatest hits, people don't talk about this. The Eagles' Greatest Hits is the biggest selling album of all time. It jockeys between that and Michael Jackson's Thriller. And actually I think Thriller now is #1 since Michael Jackson died again. But the Eagles' Greatest Hits is #2. What people don't realize is part of the reason why it's sold that many, I think it's like 25 million copies, is because throughout the entirety of the 1980s and early 90s, they sold that album for $4.99. Not $9.99, which was the list price, $4.99. Why did they do that? Because they knew people liked it, and they wanted it to be the impulse buy. They wanted it to be the gum that you buy in the supermarket. You walk into the record store, and you go to buy the big release that you have, and you go, oh, Eagles' Greatest Hits. I do like a lot of Eagles, and it's only $5. Sure, why not? That's what they used to do. Now they're charging full price for that stuff. It makes no sense. If something's been out a long period of time, it has devalued somewhat, and the price should be reflective of that. But the music business is kind of upended on that regard.
Yeah, well, that was always their model. And the catalog records were more money than the hits.
Yeah.
Than the hits were. And it was just like your example, I made this example, or read this example. It's like going in and buying a new bathing suit in June.
Right.
You're going to pay $35. But last year's is on the rack for $12.
That's exactly right.
The music business has always been the opposite.
Right. Well, and the funny part about something like the Eagles' Greatest Hits is that by that point it was pure profit, so they could sell it for that discount because the $5 that went in their pocket was all stayed in their pocket basically. versus needing to be marketing and doing all sorts of other things to keep the costs. I mean, there's a little bit of marketing costs, but not that much.
The fascinating thing for me is right now, everybody wants an iPad 2, but there are none to be had. So people are going online and paying hundreds of dollars more for something they want. Now, of course, if Apple was run by a record industry executive, they'd be discounting it by half for the first. Same thing with some cars. I mean, for a while you couldn't get a Prius. So you can imagine going to the Toyota dealer and say, yeah, I want a new Prius, and I'm going to get it at a discount, where people were paying more than list price for things.
Well, part of that is, look, we're in the entertainment business, and you always have to do things to create a myth of entertainment. One of the easiest and best tricks that most people do is that somebody will go and play in New York, right? And they're going to do a show in New York, and you go and you see sold out. The show is sold out. Why is the show sold out? Well, because they knew that they could probably sell 2,500 tickets in New York, but chose to play the room that only hold 1,000. Why? Because it's more exciting to have 1,000 people packed in the club and 1,500 people waiting outside versus playing the room that had 3,500 people, and those same 2,500 people got in and the room wasn't so packed and nobody was outside. It's all a myth. It's all figuring out what to do. And that's where, there's a lot of that has gone out of it. That iPad thing is a great example. You charge a premium price and you create some scarcity around it. Right. You make it a prized possession to have. Digitally now, because digital music is so easy for any of us to get, whether you purchase it or steal it, it's not really matter. We all know it's easy to get, has made scarcity be a little bit more difficult on that front, which is why also people have such a difficult time charging a lot of money for music. And again, the more that the record companies really feel that music has to be at a higher price, the less that they're just going to get in. I mean, a lot of people who basically say digitally should just sell the music for $7.99, get as much of it as possible, but for hardcore fans, you sell them something extra special for a lot more money and kind of make up the difference.
Yeah. That's what Apple's doing. I mean, Apple went from the passive fan to the fanatic fan.
Yeah.
The fanatic fan will pay anything, is your example, and that's what Steve Jobs did so well, is he created fanatic Apple, people that are endeared to Apple, no matter what he puts out.
Right. Well, and the other thing is that here's an interesting thing. Has anybody ever realized that Steve Jobs, on a year-over-year basis, has released more iPhones than just about every popular act has released albums? Wait a second. I correct me if I'm wrong. The iPhone looks a hell of a lot more complicated than an album. How the heck can Steve Jobs and his entire crew create a whole new technology and create all these great new features year over year faster than Eminem can go into the studio and make an album? Wait, what costs much? The rehab costs are, you're right, that's a whole different thing. But yeah.
Most of the functions have already been decided on before each new release has been updated. Like, they knew what the iPhone 2 or 3 was going to be when they made the iPhone. They just keep tacking on things that they know they should add on. But if you come out with the best product ever today, what are you going to buy? That's it. You're going to buy this. iPhone 70,000, and then what?
Right, and by the way, that's what musicians used to do. Elton John, Stevie Wonder, Billy Joel, they had a treasure trove of songs that they knew that were going to be hits, but they didn't all put them all on one album. They knew to save songs. They're no dummies. They have to be touring. They have to be drinking and snorting coke. They have a lot of things to do. So, they had to save some of that creativity and space it out over several records, and they did it quickly. I mean, you look at the fertile period in the early 70s, all those guys, Stevie Wonder did 4 albums in 3 years, and in that same 3-year period, he had a car accident where he was in a coma for 2 days. And it was the most creative music he's ever made in his life. And we have not seen a single artist in the last 10 years who's done that. It's crazy. It's crazy to me.
Well, let's look at a different angle from the book. I found this fascinating. I'm sure some of you are fans of Grey's Anatomy or CSI. So they have, one of the tricks they have is multiple storylines. And what you referenced in the book was taking that attention deficit situation and applying it to songs where there was multiple storylines, although that's not exactly the way it was phrased,
right.
and multiple chord changes and things that are different. and actually dissecting the elements of a song and comparing it in some ways to the way some of these very popular TV shows work.
Well, sure. I mean, I think what's happened actually is when you look at great production like Mutt Lange was great at this in the 80s and 90s, and Dr. Luke, as a pop producer right now, is great at this now, which is that basically every 4, every 16 bars, there's a significant shift in the song, and there's a significant something that happens to try to grab your attention, because it just has to have multiple different things going on. There has to be multiple stuff that collides in order to keep you engaged. And I think that right now, if going back to some of the stuff we talked about here, is that there's really only 3 points that somebody leaves a song, and that's the beginning, the middle, and the end. We already dissected the beginning pretty well. The end pretty much kind of told you about that in the presentation as well. We didn't talk about the middle, and the middle generally happens at about the 2-minute mark. It's not really 2 minutes. It's actually more, you go verse, chorus, and at the end of the second chorus, people generally think they know what's happening for the rest of the song. That's why you've now started to hear a lot more songs at the end of the second chorus when they get to the bridge. The bridge is not what it was 10 years ago, which is just another extension of the same thing you heard before, because radio wanted this flat linear experience. But that second part is something that is distinctly different. My most favorite recent example is the Pink song, Raise Your Glass. You guys know that song? Familiar with that song, right? So what happens is that she's doing the song, and there's a lot of, again, great production of, every 4/16 bars as a shift. And at that exact moment in the song, all of a sudden, the chorus stops pretty much cold, the music drops out, and then she just goes and does this line, "Oh shit, I dropped my drink." It's not exactly the most risque line, but the reality is that even though it's used a lot more, profanity in music to a 13-year-old every single time is going to work. Every single time. And so by going and actually dropping out all the music and throwing in a curse at that particular point actually re-engages the person in the song, because now all of a sudden, subtly, you're saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea what's going to come next, because now the song shifted on me. And that's one of the crucial things to do. I mean, any of you who actually work with music that's created by beats, one of the hardest things to get away from is you create a good loop and you basically do that beat and you let it go. That doesn't work, because what happens is at about the 2-minute mark, what I call the mixtape mentality settles in. And the mixtape mentality becomes from so many people listening to DJ mixtapes that basically only play 1 minute to 2 minutes of a song. And when you get to that second part, the mixtape mentality settles in and you go, what's next? Because if all you do is just repeat it again, I've heard all this. I don't need to hear more of this. I got to go hear more songs. And so this need to actually create multiple chord changes, to actually do things within the song that actually engage you is key, because a linear, flat approach, one note, one chord, it's just boredom that'll settle in immediately.
I want to get to some of the questions from students here. Joseph Diaz posed a question that, TJ, do you believe that taking the chemistry of a hit song for music is good for the art, or are we scientifically creating audio junk food and force-feeding it to our radio listeners?
The answer is we are scientifically creating audio junk food for the listeners. I'm not going to deny that, and that it is absolutely crucial that we do that in order to make art. Now let me explain that. No. To make art, but not for those songs. You see, you have to understand, the music business ecosystem needs money for that art. Art in the music business rarely makes money. And we can go and poo-poo record companies all we want, but Steve and I have been friends and have worked with hundreds of these people, and most of them, as much as we can badmouth them, they're real passionate music fans. They really are. And they'd love to be able to put out art. And they can only put out art if there's money coming in. And what ended up happening is that the music business ecosystem of old was that you create audio junk food that sold millions upon millions of dollars, of which they could take the, making up a number, $50 million in profit, and they can slice off $2 million and go create some art with it. Well, guess what happens when that $50 million goes down to 10? They don't have $2 million to slice off from art. The problem of the music business on that front right now is that as long as there is not successful pop music, then there is not investment money for art. And the people that make a lot of those pop music do actually want to make the art. And so actually, the two of them go hand in hand. If we don't have these mega pop hits, then it's a scary time, because the artists who need money to create true visionary art are going to be really out of luck.
Kelly Sullivan posed this question: do you see radio having to incorporate emo and country music into their playlists, or do you see the influence of radio in making a song a hit diminishing in the near future?
Radio as an influencer diminishes every year, but radio is not as important as people in radio like to think it is, but it doesn't diminish as much as people in digital like to presume it is. Radio is still by far the most important factor in cementing a song as a hit. In regards to other genres coming in, I think that that's kind of crucial for radio to have, just because, again, it's diversity. I mean, you're seeing right now on Top 40 radio in particular a wall of sound where they're not even playing ballads anymore. It's literally just this solid wall of beats. And that's been kind of engaging for the last kind of year and a half, because it's just loud and it's visceral and it's the pop junk food that we just talked about. But at some point that fatigue is going to set in, and what's really going to want to keep people engaged is going to be variety. And that's, by the way, why people are going to the web, because my variety is different than Steve's variety, which is different than your variety, which is different than yours. Every single one of us in this room, I can pretty much guarantee, listens to at least something in every major music genre, at least some artist. But the artists and the songs that we find are the ones that we like are going to be completely dissimilar. Radio as a mass medium can only look for the commonalities, and therefore it has difficulty in doing that. That's why, as Pandora in particular starts to go into car stereos in the next 5 years, and you can actually get radio that's programmed to yourself, as you add into continual increased usage of portable music devices played through car stereos, that variety is going to come from other places, because radio, just by its physical nature, can't actually do it. Steve, what you do over at Satellite is the best approximation of that, simply because you have 100 channels to switch through. The difficulty in that is when you have 100 channels to switch through, presuming you're going to switch through all 100, I know pretty much most people don't, look, I did the experiment where I basically said, I'm going to go flip through all the music channels on Sirius XM, and I'm going to give each song 7 seconds to impress me. By the time I go through everything, by the time I get back to the beginning, the song that was at the beginning has already switched to another song. So you don't have time to actually, it's not like in old where you had 6 stations programmed and you could just flip through 6 stations for 5 seconds each and figure out which song was the best. So again, the problem there is that it makes it difficult for music discovery even within that variety.
And that goes back to your statement where you said that actually you think the internet hindered the discovery of new music because there's fragmentation over choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a fascinating question John asked. You're like this. In your book, you suggest that the tempos of hit songs are largely decided by the drugs used in that time period. What tempo is today's hit, and why? Drugs?
It's a good question. As somebody who is not currently using many drugs, I don't know. What I can tell you is that right now for popular music, there actually seems to be 2 tempos of music that are kind of settling in as being popular. One is kind of a loping 80 to 90 beat per minute kind of song that's slow but not quite slow. It's kind of a little bit kind of it's sort of drug induced in a way, but it's more of a sex jam kind of tempo. And then the other one is tempos that are more around 120 to 130 beats per minute, your club tempo, which is generally I think right now actually less about drugs, but when you kind of think of clubs and club culture, it's kind of I think about it like vodka and Red Bull. It's just that you kind of have this downer and upper at the same time, and that kind of produces a bit more rhythmic heart rate, but not necessarily quite as fast as Coke used to do.
And Red Bull has a label now.
And Ribble has their own label. I wonder, I should actually talk to them about that, if they time the music to the drink. Anyways, the interesting thing in the book, though, is which is actually the one thing that I will freely admit has not actually come true in my book quite yet, is I talk about the whole chapter on a walking tempo. And the walking tempos were going to actually be pretty popular because as more people listen to music portably, you listen to music that has your comfortable heart rate, and people, that's just you go. That's where the drug reference comes in. For those who haven't read that part of the book, is that the music you enjoy tends to be the music that responds to however your heart rate is at that particular moment in time. So you're on drugs and you have a faster heart rate, you're going to respond more to faster music. Most people, what I said is as more people were actually out there walking, songs with a walking tempo were going to become more popular. I've actually found that that's not happened, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily because that's still a little bit too slow for most radio. It doesn't feel quite comfortable while you're listening to radio, or if it may just be that we are actually experienced that as mobile as we are with phones, that we're actually a bit more sedentary, more than we'd like to be. Is that we're either, kind of like in ADD, it's extremes. We're either kind of lounging on the couch with our friends, not doing much, and just talking on our phones and our computers, or we're out and we're raging hard. And the midpoint of just kind of casually walking doesn't happen nearly as much as I presumed it might.
Many years ago, in Rolling Stone, the Who's Pete Townsend was trying to explain why classic rock mattered, why it was successful. And his theory was that as people mature, somewhere along the way, they stop wanting to hear new music, and they sort of get, not the best choice of words here, stuck in a particular time period, and that's the music soundtrack for their life. Now that would sort of make things a little more difficult, because if you're a classic rock fan, I don't know how many of those classic rock songs would be applicable to walking.
Well, there's that too. I mean, and that basically does happen. Is that basically what I found is that by the time when you turn 25 years old, you start to slow down in the amount of new music that you listen to. Mostly because basically life gets in the way. Is that all of a sudden now you got to actually worry about paying bills versus going out in clubs as much. You've got to take care of your kids that you just started having, and all these kind of things, and life just starts getting in the way for most people. And in addition to life preventing them from experiencing new music quite as much, is that life is stressful and they want comfort zone, and comfort zone is take me back to when I was 15 and didn't have to worry about this shit. So and that tends to be why a lot of that stuff tends to get stuck in people's minds more often than not.
But you're assuming a baseline prior to the age 25 that people are very passionate and music consumers, and I would dare say that the generation coming up now does not prioritize music as important as it was to the baby boomers, if you will. And so I think the experience of going to a Tower record store doesn't exist anymore. So that's been replaced in a lot of people's minds by going to the Apple store.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, just to give you a startling fact, I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to debunk for years is the notion that stealing is destroying the music business, right? I mean, I'm sure you've all heard that, right? Now, I'm not even going to ask. I know you all have stolen music. I'm not even going to bother. Here's the interesting fact for you, okay? 5% of people on the internet in the US, 5% on a monthly basis visit a legal music website, mostly iTunes, visit a legal music website to buy music, okay? 9.5% of people on the internet in any given month visit an illegal site to illegally download music, okay? So sounds like there's some support there to say that the music industry says, well, yeah, more people are stealing music than buying music digitally, and they're right. But to me, the bigger problem is, why do 85% of the people on the internet, 85%, neither care to buy or steal music? That's the problem the industry faces. You're absolutely right. There is an apathy right now to music and music consumption. People in general just don't care either way. And you got to get them back to caring. The interesting thing is that 15% actually correlated. I found out in another book. There's been several dips over history in the recorded music business. The one that I found out was one that happened in 1949, and basically after World War II, basically you had all these people coming back. And now all of a sudden there's all the, army people, and they can't get jobs, and and the economy had kind of issues. The depression was gone, but it didn't really get fixed. And the families hadn't really started having babies; they were just getting started. And recorded music plummeted. Literally, we think that this nice, this slow 10-12% dip in sales each year has been a problem. Record sales dipped 45%. From 1948 to 1949, 45% in 1 year. And they did a study at that time, and they did the survey, and that survey actually found that it dipped to only, get this, 15% of the population buying music. So actually, I think it's kind of funny that we're actually, from a consumption standpoint, we're actually at a part that happened before. Now, the question then you say is, well, what did they do to get out of that consumption? Well, or get out of that, the first thing that they did was they actually started marketing something called high fidelity records. They actually started creating a reason to buy music again by creating this aura that records were at a better sounding and that there was better stereos. And as that coupled with increased money, the disposable income for people to spend, they were able to buy these new stereos that then had to buy the new records, and slowly but surely everything came back to a point where then all of a sudden you then, 5 years later had the birth of rock and roll, which actually then created a whole new genre that exploded the whole thing. I think we're at the beginning of that, and I don't know exactly what that new genre is going to be per se. Or what that new fidelity is going to be. But I think a lot of it's going to be more of what we talked about here, which is just predicated on, it's actually just a new pattern. It's that pattern of YouTube. I mean, the fact of, YouTube as a whole is, potentially, if it keeps growing at the rate that it's growing, which it does look like it's going to do, YouTube alone could be, $250,000 coming into the music business. Might even be more if Vivo actually takes off the way that they want it to take off. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what's going to be happening.
But who says the consumption of music has to be more than 15%? I mean, I could make the case that the baby boomers have gone through society changing all the institutions. So maybe that generation prioritized music more than any prior generation or any post generation, and so we've accepted that as the norm when actually that's the exception, and so we've have to lower our expectations and understand. And yes, there is a technology boom with the portable, started with the Sony Walkman, as you pointed out, and now today with the MP3 players. So I'm not so sure that 85% that's still fiddling around on the internet are potential music consumers. It may not be something that people have. And plus, the distractions available today and the fragmentation, you can go back to pointing out on Sunday nights, Ed Sullivan was the only rallying point to see music. So now you have all these other options. So maybe 15% is the number.
Well, that may be it. 15% may be the number from the purchasing standpoint. But of course, the question you ask is like, all right, well, this is all about actual ownership of music. But when you get down to the number of people, the number of people who are streaming music on video sites is actually 20 to 25%. People that are actually listening to music on radio sites is another 20 to 25%. And there's some overlap there, but you actually get to the point where you probably get to close to half of the population on the internet streams at least one piece of music in any given month. And that's the interesting part, because that's basically akin to radio. And you're absolutely right. There are plenty of people over time who all only did was just listen to radio. The trick now is that we're actually now going to get paid at radio. And the tough part is on the other side is that the people that used to pay a premium don't necessarily have to pay the premium quite as much anymore. Or what might also be happening is, I know to some of my friends and people that I know, is that they're still spending money, but that money is now spent over less money across more artists. And then that becomes difficult, because then you as one individual artist makes it difficult. Then you couple in the fact that, again, all of the distractions going on, which I still think is the primary culprit to all of this. And that's why, by the way, a third of all new music sales comes from a list of 100 songs. Is because most people, when they get to a point when they say, I want to go and get exposed to new music, they just go to a chart because there's so much out there. They're just like, oh, hell, I can't do it. There was, here's an interesting thing. iTunes digital single sales last year was flat to 2009. Technically it went up 1%, but basically it was flat. And the music industry immediately said, see, digital single sales are done. They're not growing anymore. Well, what actually happened was Apple started increasing sales of apps because of iPads and iPhones. They started increasing sales of movies. And all of a sudden, the shelf space on iTunes, which used to be all music, got cluttered with other products. And the reality is that most people on iTunes, because there's so much music out there, buy from two places: the featured product and the chart. That's it. That's most of the sales. Featured product and the chart. So when you take away slots of the featured product, guess what? The sales stop. And now that that new pattern has actually been in place, guess what? Digital sales are up 8% this year. And we're talking, when you're actually talking numbers in the billions of songs sold, 8% is a large number. So, there's so many other factors at play to all of this. Was there a question back there? No.
Dave Gable asked this question. Who do you think is most morally incorrect? The industry legitimately hoarding the money that artists made, or the consumer for illegally taking what isn't rightfully theirs?
Wow, that's a good question.
Judge Judy?
That's a really good question. You probably have to get down to it and say that the consumer at the end of the day is probably the one who's most morally wrong. The industry hoarding money, it's not that the industry is really morally wrong. The industry just does a really, really bad job of explaining the value of what they do. I mean, let's be honest. It's like, what does it take to make a record? Well, even if I do a record for cheap, it's going to be, $30,000. Then I got to make a video, even if that's cheap, and then I got to try to actually get it to radio, and I got to do all these things. And the Tonight Show's calling, and that's $3,000, $4,000 to fly the whole band out to LA to play the Tonight Show, and on and on and on and on. And it's a lot of money. And by the way, it takes a lot of people who have to know the right people to get it done. And what happens is that the record industry has created an ecosystem where nobody wants to take risks. For better or for worse, these record companies are taking risks by signing acts. Because they're between everything that they're going in, they put in $1 million to a project on average before they see if they have anything. And nowadays, at best, I'd say an average music project probably grosses what, 2 million? Maybe nowadays? Maybe? Average? Maybe. And the problem is that, look, I don't know who you are, but let's say you're an artist and I wanted to sign you, okay? Now I could go to you and say, all right, this is what I'm going to do. We're going to be partners on this. I'm going to sign you. I'm not going to give you any money right now, but I'm going to sign you, and once I cover all my costs, money's going to go 50-50. You get 50%, I get 50%. Now, if I go spend $1 million and the thing only grosses $500,000, we both get bupkis. You literally get nothing. Or if I go to you and say, all right, look, I want to sign you, and I'm going to give you $150,000 now, but I'm only going to give you 15%. But if that record only sold $500,000, guess what? You got that $150,000. The issue right now, I think, the issue as it's always been is that as artists, you basically have a choice. Do you want the money now or do you want the money later? And most artists, based on legitimate financial needs, need to take the money now. And by taking the money now, you basically allow somebody to take the money later. It's a bank. It's an extortionist bank. I'm not going to disagree there, but it's a bank. And if you have the wherewithal and the resources to just say, I'm doing a lot of work with this artist out of Nashville called the Civil Wars. And they managed to just work their tails off and actually sold on their own 50,000 albums completely independently. And they're getting a lot of major label offers, and they're rebuffing it for that very reason. But what they're also doing is that they're not taking the now $500,000 that they've gotten, and they're not taking it and going and buying a house or a car. They're taking it and reinvesting it in the band. And they're going and saying, how can we basically take that $500,000 and hire the right people to get us to a point that might get us to $5 million? And maybe we're not going to get to $5 million, but we'd rather spend the money to try to make our careers happen. Every artist, I think, has some version of that choice, and unfortunately, I can't say that a record company is morally wrong because an artist wants to take money up front versus splitting more on the back end. Alanis Morissette actually is a great example of an artist who did not take money up front and has made way more money than just about every other artist in the 90s as a result.
Somebody back there? You had a
I was going to say, I think that like this last week we had an artist who came into us, but we wrote the hits, well not wrote, but recorded hits by Party at Crowdfunding.
Mhm.
She made $17,000, and that was like the one check that she got. And then 25 years later, when they wiped her balance, she was making 25 years later, she was getting like what was it, $50,000 a year. And so we looked at, I think everybody heard that was like, oh crap, for 25 years, her income was literally being stolen by the record label. So you have a generation of people our age who have come up, and the only industry that we know is an industry that stole from the artists that we cared about, that failed to develop talent the likes of what was around in the 70s when artist development was actually a thing. So we have an industry that has not been loyal to its consumers, has not been loyal to its acts, has not developed talent, has not developed innovation. So how are we morally wrong for stealing the little crude amount that we actually want?
You're still hurting the artist. You're not.
Yeah.
I mean, as a byproduct, you might be hurting the label, but you're hurting the artist. So it's.
I don't support a legal download. I'm just saying that how could you say that is more morally wrong?
Well, look. I mean, you're also, we're asking for a level of morals, and the question was asked was which do I think was more morally wrong, and I'm not necessarily thinking that either is necessarily there. It's also asking me if I like an apple or a kumquat. I mean, they're different. And by the way, I don't think that, I think that record companies are stupid. Like, for example, there was a band on EMI called Op Shop, and the only reason why I remember this band is because of this story. So this band is called Op Shop, and I'm doing research for this book 3 years ago, and I discovered this band because I was just curious as what other things happen around the world, and in the process I discover a chart in New Zealand and see this band Op Shop is the only name that I don't know. I said, Op Shop, what the heck is this? So what do, I go to YouTube. I said, I want to go hear this band. And I go and listen to the first song, and I thought it was great. I listened to a second song, and I thought it was great. And my instinct is, I want the album. So I go to iTunes. Well, the album's not available in the US. I go to Amazon. Well, it's not available on Amazon in the US. The only way that I can get it is if I wanted to actually spend $50 or more to actually get it as an import and hope that it's going to show up 2.5 weeks later. So what did I do? I stole the record. Question becomes then who's and I asked that question, who ends up being the wrong person in that scenario? Is it me because I stole it? Or is it the record company who did not make it available for me to buy at the point that I wanted to buy it? It's a hard question. Because the record company probably has a whole bunch of things in mind. For one, they probably signed a record contract with that artist that said that the minute you put it out in the States, you have to pay us another $50,000. Right. And my $10 isn't going to make a whole hell of a lot of difference to them.
Right.
So that's one problem. That's a problem of the contract, not a problem of what I did. These are the problems that we're all facing right now, is that they're still creating these contracts and these situations that are wrong. There have been widespread theft of artists' money, but a lot of that was because there's either and that does still kind of go on. I mean, art money that is legitimately owed to artists, pretty much you have to go to a record company and say, can I please have that money now? And then you have to yell and scream about that for 1.5 years, and then finally they'll throw you some money.
Audit.
Yeah, auditing. My favorite story was a friend of mine who was a producer for 60 Minutes, had the Dixie Chicks come in, and when they did the story, he goes and says, so you sold this many things and collected $200 million. How much of that has gone to you? And they, Dan Rather asked that question rather innocently, and then the next day they audited the record company.
Wow. James Mercer asked that you've mentioned that simple and repetitive lyrics help create hits. Even if a person does not like the song, it's going to be stuck in your head. He says this is why Rebecca Black's song is so popular. One observation that he's made is the performer's image seems to boost a hit song as well. I've heard many people say they love Trey Songz because of how he looks and not his vocal ability. What's your take?
Everything is about a package. The interesting thing about how we view music as the industry and versus the consumer viewing music is two completely different things. The artist tends to come to something and say, I start and say, I decide I have abilities. I can play, I can sing, I have whatever talents I have. I can dance, whatever they may be. Then after they decide that they have that, they say, okay, well, what's my image going to be? Am I going to be this genre? Am I going to be that genre? What kind of clothes am I going to wear? How am I going to look? And then once they kind of figure that out, then they start saying, all right, now let me put songs to that people are going to like. Now the consumer, however, comes in the opposite way. The consumer first exposure is the song. First thing is they listen to the song and say, do I like this song? And then once they determine that they like the song, then they start going and saying, okay, does this person actually look good, and do they actually kind of imbibe the way that I like to live my life? Are they similar? Do they have a coolness that fits in with my coolness, basically? And then once they figure that out and they agree with that, then they start going and saying, all right, is this person actually any good? It's the last thing that people actually ask. And because of that, that's, I think it's exactly that, is that, there are people that the talent is second. But what I've found now is that if an artist is going to actually last for a career more than a year and a half or 2 years, there is underlying talent, but that talent may be completely different. Having seen him before, Trey Songz actually can sing his ass off. Problem is that lately he's been saddled with songs that don't show it. Taylor Swift isn't a great singer. She's one of the best songwriters I've seen in my life. And that's where her talent is coming from. Talent is different for everybody. I mean, and even Justin Bieber, for crying out loud. I mean, he's not necessarily the most, in my opinion, the most technically proficient singer, but he has the most overall talent that is actually quite impressive. So, there definitely has to be talent there, even if it may not be readily apparent. Lady Gaga is another person who's got a ridiculous amount of talent that her songs don't necessarily always show.
A question Nick asked is, in the Length in the Songs chapter, you mentioned radio has to break the 3-minute 30-second rule to stay competitive. If radio hadn't broken that rule, do you think Freebird or Stairway to Heaven would be the legends they are, or even be around?
What's the question?
So just the question is, if radio had not broken their own rule of a 3-minute 30-second, would songs like Freebird and Stairway to Heaven ever had a chance, and would they have become as legendary?
No, probably not. But I mean, it's the interesting thing. Like one of the legendary music business stories in particular with Stairway to Heaven is that Stairway to Heaven was never officially released as a single. This was, at the time, the new format FM radio, where they could basically do whatever they want. Just went and found that song, and they didn't put it as a single because it didn't sound good when you put it on a 45, so they couldn't sell it that way. And B, it didn't fit into that neat little format. But FM radio at the time could do a lot of whatever they wanted, and so people found that song and they played it on their own. It is happening now to a certain degree. Lady Gaga's Bad Romance actually being the best example of that, where that song is 5 minutes long, and just the way that she does it, it feels like it's only 3 minutes and 45 seconds, but it's actually much longer than that. Radio is actually in an interesting spot right now because they are, as a corporate group, they're so fearful for their jobs that none of them want to take any chances, and therefore they are only playing records that are proven hits. And that proven hits means that the proving ground is what's happening online. And through that, if that means that a 5-minute Lady Gaga song, or maybe even a 6.5-minute Stairway to Heaven, becomes super huge online, and a record company then points that out, then very likely those songs will make it to radio on that point, because they can point to its predetermined success, therefore providing a very low level, if no risk, to a radio station.
So you're saying that like what you mentioned, that like top 100 songs that were downloaded, so you, like a radio would look at those top 100 and only play like the top 40 of them, like that sort of.
I mean, in a rough way, yeah.
Depending on the genre and like what the station is.
Yeah, and what's happening right now is that most record companies are actually hedging their bets in this regard. Most of the popular songs tend to be about, I think the average is 3 minutes and 45 seconds, with a couple of songs that extend well past 4 minutes being weighted down by a clump of songs in the 3:15 to 3:30 range. And I think that that's largely because the radio, the record companies are hedging their bets. They're trying to create short, snappy songs that will work well on the internet in their own regard to get notice, but then be acceptable length for radio to play. Because you got to remember, radio, again, it's just all the myth-making business. It's one of the things that people love to do at radio. They go and say, we play more songs than our competitor. We're going to do 10 songs in a row. Well, the way you play 10 songs in a row is you play the 10 shortest songs, because they still have to play the ads at the same part. So, they'll employ tricks. I mean, I actually heard in England, they're actually testing doing radio edits of songs that are only 2.5 minutes long. But, and that actually we may see more of that as well, where there's actually the online version, and then there's the radio version. And there may actually be differences in that point, but then there'll be other songs depending on the artist, like Lady Gaga. I don't recall created an edited version of Bad Romance. Do you know if she did or not?
I know she did a country version.
She did a country version of Born This Way, but not an edited Bad Romance. So it's like, if an artist wants to stick to their guns,
was always the whole chapter on remixes.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other thing on my, it's like it becomes a win-win situation, is that if you have the full version and then you have a radio version, if you like the full version, I talk about having multiple versions of songs, because then that helps facilitate a second, third, and fourth listen for familiarity, because the person who liked the full version might come back and say, well, how exactly is the radio edit different from the full version? Well, now you just actually got somebody to listen to the song a second time, which if you didn't have that version, you would not be able to do.
Michael was asking, in Chapter 4, you mentioned that artists should be extending songs by 15 seconds because it'll mean higher royalties and be more likely to be a hit song faster. He's asking, why do you feel that a song would do better if there was a prolonged fade?
Well, I again, there's, this is one of those things in the book where I probably have not necessarily correctly diagnosed where everything is going to be happening. I mean, as I said earlier, most songs right now are ending with a closed, a very cold ending. In lengthening a song, I think I had originally felt and presumed that having a prolonged fade would be a subtle way. If a fade was going to be 10 seconds, there's not really that much of a difference if you extend it to 15 seconds, as an example. But now, as I've kind of seen and observed how people are really, working with things, I think that I would probably change that for the second edition of the book, in that the fade would actually probably be more of a liability in that regard, just for the reasons that I had stated earlier.
Yes, sir.
A question. I don't know if it was either in your book or I read your interview with Hypot.com.
Mm-hmm.
Support interview, and I saw that you have and you also mentioned that you have a pretty good background in music that would be played in the club, like you DJ and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about hit songs as opposed to turntable songs, and how those turntable songs are being sold more now because people want music that they can do things too. So you also talk about having a interesting 7-second intro, and you're also talking about reaching different climax of the song. I'm wondering why more labels aren't signing more producers and electronic musicians, because they do this stuff easy and their songs are more readily available for TV and film. And you talked about Red Bull having a new record label. They hold electronic music and beat battles every year that go on throughout the whole year, the Red Bull beat battles.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't record labels making that switch like that?
I actually think, many of them are. Interscope in particular for many years has been renowned for signing a lot of producers as staff producers, sometimes as producers / artists, Timbaland, and sometimes just as producers. And you just end up, and then sometimes it's label deals. Like, I think Red One has a label deal with Interscope Records, so that he.
I'm sorry, but a lot of these big labels, they have the producers working under them, but they have to produce their songs to another name. Like Kanye, he'll or Timbaland, he'll have a bunch of producers under him, but when they make the beat, it's going to be under Timbaland's name. That's how it works. So they're kind of like work for hire.
Oh, so you're actually talking more about, are you talking about then producers?
Like producers, like people like Rat Tat Tat. And like Rat Tat Tat, they really didn't get famous until, they did a song for Cudi, and then Chitty Bang Bang sampled some of their music, but other than that, they had to be like discovered by a record label first before they got any real love and recognition and money. So I'm saying, why can't labels just sign bands like, electronic duos or whatever as Rat Tat Tat while they're big, instead of waiting for them to break more or something? You know what I mean? Like, it makes no sense.
There's probably about 3 or 4 questions in that, and I'll try to see if I can remember and answer all of them, because I've got about 4 answers in my head. One of them is record companies, much like the radio stations, are actually becoming way more risk averse. I have heard many times in the last couple of years, as I'm sure you probably have, where there's undiscovered talent that clearly, if I played them for you, you'd go, wow, they're great. And the record companies hear them too and go, wow, they're great. And then don't sign them. Why didn't you sign them? You just thought it was great. Yeah, but I want to wait until there's a buzz. They're risk averse. They would rather spend $1 million tomorrow on something they know can make $10 million than spend $100,000 today on something that they have no idea what it's going to make. That's what they've come down to. They're risk averse. They do not, again, it comes down to that question of them not supporting art. When nobody knows about it, it falls into the art category, and they don't have money for that anymore, really. When it comes down to actually showing commercial success, sometimes it's art, but in essence they're doing that. So it really a lot of it does come down to that, whereas that it doesn't really matter the genre. It's more of that they're only going to support what they know they're going to make money on, more than anything else. Then there's another part, which is that you got to think about how they make money. And even as, I'm presuming you've talked in here about 360 deals that are now kind of the norm in record companies. So even as now they are making more money from these other revenue streams, the reality is that pretty much the bulk of their money still comes from the CDs that they sold and the downloads that they sell. So if it's not going to sell those, then it's going to be difficult for them. And part of the problem is that there are acts out there that have significant buzz online, that when you actually look at their business models, you go, this isn't going to sell anything. This is going to be, an act that, they're going to, have 250,000 songs passed around, but when you get down to it, they're not going to sell anything. There's an act out of Denver called Pretty Lights, and Pretty Lights has given away 1 million albums legitimately through his own website. And part of that is because he kind of recognized his genre of music, which is, kind of a kind of amorphous electronic beat-driven stuff. Fairly good, but not necessarily the stuff that in the business typically sells. If he tried to sell those same 4 or 5 albums, he might have sold collectively 50 or 60,000. But instead, he gave them away, sold 1 million. The reverse of that is that he's able to do it on his own, and he sold out Red Rocks last year, which is a huge venue. Guy's making plenty of money on T-shirts and concerts. But he's created a new business model for himself. And even if I don't think a record company would want to sign him unless he gave away a piece of that. But he'd be like, well, so then what are you offering me? Because you're not going to get me radio. You're not going to get me additional press. You're not going to get me additional dates. I'm selling out Red Rocks. Why do I need to do anything with you? Some of those. So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but it's kind of it's a multi-layered problem or issue.
You talked about buzz. I think 6 months ago, one of the biggest buzz bands Interscope had was the South African hip-hop act, Diane Ort. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So, huge buzz, lots of YouTube, a couple of really primo dates. I doubt they sold any CDs. I doubt anybody in this room even owns a track.
They sold less than 10,000.
but way less than 10,000, I'm sure. And then the big buzz that everybody's trying to chase right now, and they don't seem to be inclined to want to sign with anybody, seem to be having more fun, is Odd Future, where they just messing around out there and just driving everybody crazy, and people like doing all sorts of stupid stuff. Like I think they told Diddy, if you wanted a meeting with us, then you got to bring Justin Bieber with you. And he did stuff like that. We are getting a little later than I'd prefer to keep everybody here, but I did want to throw this question out that Roxanne, who said, great book.
Oh,
by the
thank
way.
you.
Okay, but she
Where are
wanted to
you?
know,
I gotta
she wanted to know if there are any popular songs that don't follow the formula. Exceptions.
Sort of. I mean, there are popular songs. I mean, probably the most popular song last year that didn't follow the new formula as I lay out in the book is probably Lady Antebellum's "Need You Now," which has a long intro and a very, very traditional song structure. That's probably the biggest one from last year that didn't necessarily follow what I have in the book. But a lot of what I also talk about in the book is that if any song tries to do everything that I have in the book and put it all into one song, then the song is almost certainly going to fail. I think every song has to kind of pick and choose which elements really work best to be able to make that song a little bit better. But not every element is right for every song. So it's not. I hesitate to even think of my book as being a formula, as more as, especially when I talk to songwriters who have really taken to the book and artists who have taken to the book, that it's more of just a guidepost of here are the different elements to think about and why you need to think about it. And then figure out, once you create a song, how can you tweak that song with some of these things in mind to make it that much more likely to be sellable.
Okay, I think I want to call it a night. Jay has a few copies of his book, which I'm sure if any of you were interested in purchasing or getting him to sign, I'm sure you could coerce him into doing that. I want to thank him for making the trek up here from Nashville.
Thank you.
So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.